Hello and welcome to another video in the Simplified opening series. This week we continue the exploration of the new developments in the Ruy Lopez. Another very quick and easy line for black to learn and play. So this week we will look at the so-called delayed Cordell variation. And if you look at the title of this video, you see that I've called it the Fisher and Nakamura's pet line. So I think this deserves some sort of introduction and historical introduction. So you may be wondering what's Fisher got to do with this. Well, in the early 60s, Fisher famously said that he solved one E4. And what he meant by that, in fact, was the Cordell variation for black. Now, if you're wondering, the Cordell variation rises after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now the move bishop c5. So Fisher was actually quite successful with the Cordell variation with black. He played this variation in the early 60s up to the candidates tournaments in Curacao in 1962, where he used it, for example, in the game against Mikhail Tal to draw without too many problems. After that, interestingly, Fisher stopped playing e5 altogether, probably thinking that it was time to start beating world-class opposition, and he switched to his beloved Najdorf entirely. But it's worth noting that Fisher was actually quite successful playing the Cordell variation, most of the times drawing effortlessly all of his games where he played it. So even though he may not have solved completely the Ruy Lopez with the Cordell, he may not have been that far off, yeah, because latest developments with some subtleties actually confirm his perhaps intuitive feeling that the Cordell variation is pretty much worth employing. So let's fast forward several decades and let's check what the latest the modern grandmasters are doing. So what they're doing in the Cordell variation is that first they decided to delay it by one move by first playing a6 and after bishop a4 to go bishop c5. Now this has become extremely popular. It has been played by many players, Grischuk, Pragnananda, and Nakamura, as the title suggests, with excellent results. Possibly the most high-level game and a very important moment was played in the penultimate round of the candidates tournament in Toronto, where Nakamura played this line against Nepomniachtchi in a vital game for the top for the event's win. And he, even though he misplayed the opening a bit, he did successfully solve his problems in this variation. He also continued to play this variation with success, and we shall see some of the examples where he used it. So first of all, let's explain why a6 first. Well, the subtlety is seen that after bishop c5, white starts with c3. And now if black is to play the modern plan, which is with knight g7 instead of knight f6, for example, Fisher played knight f6 in this variation, but this exact version of the Cordell is under cloud currently. So knight g7, after short castle, knight g6, d4, we see that the bishop is forced to go to b6, yeah, and after that a4 becomes quite unpleasant for black. So ideas like a5 and putting this bishop, embarrassing the bishop on b6 is problematic. So with this understanding, now we see why it's favorable for black to insert a6 bishop a4 when the bishop first and foremost can drop back all the way to a7, and also with the bishop on a4 white cannot employ this idea of a4 himself. Therefore we go a6, we delay the Cordell, and after bishop a4 bishop c5. Now, as you probably know by now, I like these openings where the opponent doesn't have much of a choice. And this is another variation where, in fact, white has basically one critical plan. That critical plan is the advance in the center, c3, d4, as pretty much everywhere else in the Ruy Lopez. The only difference is that white can start advancing c3 d4 before or after castle. So again, we have a very practical variation where there is one plan for critical plan for white and two possible variations of that plan, which is employing it immediately, c3 d4, or employing it after castling. So these are the two main variations that we will be concentrating our attention to. And of course, I will also note some other less popular and obviously less critical possibilities for white. So one such possibility in this position is the move knight e5. The point of the move is that if knight e5, d4 is a double attack on both pieces, but this is also a possible way for black to play, because after, let's say, b5, bishop b3, take on d4, queen d4, d6, black is actually doing quite all right. However, there are better and probably simpler ways to deal with knight e5, and these depend on black's preference. You will notice in the explanations that in a lot of these variations, it is actually black who chooses in which direction to take the game. Black can choose some calmer lines, or black can choose some more complicated lines, which is, I think, is another massive, let's say, practical advantage that the delayed Cordell offers to the black player. So black gets to choose the type of plans he would like to play. So here, for example, the first instance is that if black wants to really simplify the game and experience no problems whatsoever, then the move queen e7 is the easiest one, attacking the knight. And if knight c6, check on e4, queen e2, take on e2, queen e2, dc6, well, what problems can black have here? Yeah, completely equal endgame. An alternative to that is the somewhat more complicated queen g5. So it's a double attack, attacking the knight and attacking g2. And here, white needs to exert some care. So knight g4, getting away from the attack and covering g2. Now the threat is d4. Discover the tank on the queen. So queen g6, short castle, b5. And now the idea is if bishop b3, d5, already black takes over the initiative, attacking the knight, attacking this pawn, d4, with very good development after knight f6 and so forth. So after b5, white should go d4. And we have some complications, but black is doing more than fine. Bishop a7, bishop b3, d6, knight e3, because the knight was attacked on g4. So knight drops back to e3 and knight d4. And now black regained the pawn, very good development, knight comes to e7. Short castle can happen and so forth. You can explore this in a bit more depth. For example, there are some interesting lines arising after, let's say, knight c3, then knight d5, when black plays c6, inviting knight c7 and so forth. You can check this with your engines. Fun lines, black is doing great, but again, like I said, this is far from critical, so no need to spend too much time on that. Let's turn our attention to the more critical lines. So let's start with the plan of castling first, and then going knight c3 and d4. Already here, black has a choice. Now, we will take as the main line Nakamura's choice, and other strong players' choice, which is knight g7. But it's worth pointing out that there is an alternative plan here for black, which keeps more, let's say, positional complexity in the position. And that plan starts with the move d6. Yeah, d6, with the idea of bishop g4. This has been played, for example, by Alexander Grishchuk. So c3, preparing d4, and now bishop g4. So already the idea is to, for example, try to fight against the move d4. Let's say d4. And now, again, black has different ways how to react. One is to wreck white's kingside structure by taking on f3, gf3, and now going b5. So you can see black can choose to have more complex game and try to outplay the opponent, or we have the simpler ways, which we will also take a look at. So dc5, ba4, cd6, cd6, and we obviously have a very complex strategical situation on the board when white's weakened king will be a major factor here. So black will likely go knight g7, short castle, then f5, maybe knight g6, and black will try to play for an attack against white's king. So that's one possibility, but there is another one, take on d4 instead of bishop f3, cd4, bishop a7. For example, this was played in the game Hu Yifan Grishchuk. in the Rapid tournament in Astana in 2023. The point is, if d5, b5, black does not lose a piece. If instead of d4, after bishop g4, white plays something like h3, the move h5 is possible, but bishop h5 is an alternative. And now if, let's say, d3, knight g7, knight bd2, castles, g4, bishop g6, knight h4, king h8, knight df3, and d5. And already you see again, it's a very strategically complex position. All the pieces are on the board, but black has really nothing to complain about in this position. Very smooth development, central control already playing the center has started, and a really fantastic starting position of the middle game. This was played in the game Grishchuk, this time with white, against Petrov at the World Rapid in Almaty 2022. You can check the game in the database. It finished eventually in a draw, but already here black is doing quite all right. So that's one possible plan, like I mentioned, after short castle, d6 and bishop g4. Interesting way, less explored plan, less popular also, but I think a good alternative to the main lines with knight g7, which we will take a look at now. So knight g7, now c3 is normally played. If knight e5, this time knight e5, d4, b5, we already saw this reaction, bishop b3, bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, d6, already it's a good position for black. Normally this arises in the Arkhangelsk variation, where the knight is not on e7 but rather on f6, but this doesn't really affect the position and the evaluation that black is doing quite all right. So f4, c5, let's say, and then the knight will drop back to g6 or c6 and so forth. So black is fine. Therefore, after knight g7, white usually goes c3 for the main plan, knight g6, d4, and bishop a7. So we see now the knight on g6 lends nice support to the pawn on e5. We will see what happens if white actually goes after that e5 pawn. It can easily backfire on white. And this is the starting position of this variation, popular tabia, if you will, when white's main move is the move bishop g5, forcing the weakening of swords f6. But I think we should explore first what happens is if white goes after that pawn on e5 with taking on c6, dc6, and now knight takes e5. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, and queen e7. So black basically wants to regain the pawn when he will remain with a pair of bishops with a fantastic position. And that is what white should allow, because defending the pawn with bishop f4 can very quickly land actually white in a losing position after g5, bishop g3, h5, threatening h4, h3, h4, bishop h2, bishop e6, and the engine already says black is winning. It's 14 moves, but black is winning because rook can come to d8, then g4, h3, and it's a tremendous attack. Yeah, the extra pawn doesn't really matter, and black is, well, queen g5 after that, winning for black. So white gets greedy, he gets punished. Therefore, instead of bishop f4, white should simply go queen f3, and the position is indeed equal. Queen e5, bishop f4, queen e7, queen g3. So white is pressuring c7, but after short castle there is counterattack on e4, and let's say knight d2, bishop b6. Absolutely no problems for black. Yeah, bishop e6 comes next, and it's no problems. Pair of bishops, easy position, equality. So this is the tactical justification that white cannot win a pawn. So let's now check some other lines before embarking on the main line of bishop g5. So let's check another natural move, the move d5. It appears dangerous because after knight c7, d6 appears that white is gaining some initiative and creating some disorganization, lack of harmony in black's position. But the point is that black's position in this line is like a coiled spring. It kind of gets kind of coiled, yeah, and then there's this big release of energy. So to show you how this is demonstrated in practice, we take on d6, queen takes d6, bishop b8, getting rid of the queen, queen drops back to d3, and now short castle. And if you look at it, black is basically almost finished with the development. There is the threat of d5 now to completely liberate the play, and all the pieces are already developed. The knight bishop can come back to a7, the bishop will be developed on this h3 c8 diagonal, and everything is great for black. So c4 is an attempt to stop d5, and black again has a choice. He can play in a more slow manner, let's say h6, stopping some bishop g5 pins, or for example knight c3 and now d6. And this position reminds us a little bit of the maybe the Kalashnikov variation, where black's plan is associated with play on the king side. Bishop comes to e6 to get good control over the d5 square, then f5 at some point, the f file will be open, maybe knight f4 will happen, the bishop can go back to a7, and long term black will be playing on the king side. So this is one way to play, but there is also a sharper way to play and more direct, which is b5, and after cb5 d5, and already taking over the initiative in the center. So ed5, bishop f5, developing with tempo, queen b3, e4, knight d4, queen d6, threatening mate on h2. So already see how black develops with tempo with every move and develops a very strong initiative. So g3, and now bishop a7, and the initiative is actually quite strong. Black will regain at least one pawn, the one on d5, and the activity of the pieces compensates for the other. So already very good compensation for black. So you can see that this move d6, which may look at first sight as threatening or putting some pressure, in fact backfires for white, and it is black who very often can get the initiative. So that is the move d5. The move rook e1 is possible and likely can transpose to the positions that we will be looking later on after, let's say, short castle, h3, and now I move d6, even though d5 is possible as well in this particular position. Then we get a position where black has not played the move f6, doesn't really affect the position much. If anything, it's a little bit more in black's favor because the a2 g8 diagonal has not been weakened, and the remaining ideas still remain valid, like pushing f5 or taking on d4 and knight c7 and so forth. We will discuss this in more detail when we look at the main line with bishop g5. So the last move to take a look at before embarking on bishop g5 is what happens if white takes in the center. D takes e5, knight ce5, knight e5, knight e5, but obviously this cannot be serious for white. Let's say queen h5, queen f6, defending the knight on e5, bishop g5, queen g6, and literally no problems whatsoever after castling, d6, or maybe b5. Smooth development, no problems. That means that now we turn our attention to the main line, which is bishop g5, attacking the queen, forcing f6, and now dropping back to e3, after which black castles. So now it's time to talk a little bit about black's plans in this position. White will basically finish development with something like knight bd2, rook e1, h3. Yeah, maybe further then going knight f1, knight g3. But what is black going to do? Now black has quite a bit of a variety when it comes to choosing his plans. Now one possible plan is to keep this stronghold on e5, play a move like d6, and then maneuver behind this pawn on e5, let's say like something like knight c7, okay? Then maybe going b5, c5 in standard Ruy Lopez fashion, or maneuvering even further by putting maybe knight on f4, the other knight from e7 coming to g6. So here the idea is that you keep that stronghold on e5 and maneuver behind it, yeah? Maneuver with the pieces. Some possible ideas are, let's say, the king will likely go to h8 anyway, yeah? So queen e8, knight d8, knight e6 as well. Obviously that there will be no bishop on b5 after on a4, sorry, after b5, so the queen can come to e8 and the knight can move from c6. So the knight can come to e6 and then maybe even to f4. So you have all these maneuvers behind the pawn structure. So that's one possible, let's say, plan for black in the ensuing positions. Other plans are more dynamic and they are more centrally oriented, in a sense that black would like to play more in the center using the pawns. So this is normally done by taking on d4 at some point, and after, let's say, cd4, concentrating the the attention on the central breaks d5 or f5, likely aided by the move knight c7, supporting d5 or f5. So this combination of plans gives black quite a rich play, obviously, in the positions that follow, and I will mention these plans as we look at the moves. So again, the position is quite flexible for both sides, so there is a variety of move orders, but for both sides. But for example, one subtlety for black is that it's very useful for black to start with the move king h8, keeping that pawn on d7, and that gives the option of going d5 in one go. Yeah? So king h8 is a useful move anyway, getting the king out of this, let's say, open a to g8 diagonal, and then deciding whether to go d6, whether to go knight c7 without d6, and then going d5 in one go, so keeping more flexibility in the choice of plans. So let's start with different moves. We again can start with the move d5, yeah, which may look to the inexperienced eye as tricky because it attacks the knight, it attacks the bishop, but as in the previous line with d5, we will see that black's position is actually quite well prepared for this. So knight c7, bishop takes a7, rook takes a7, d6, otherwise black plays d6 and then f5 in its fantastic position on the king side with a free attack. So d6, cd6, queen d6, and now b5. So slowly black is starting to untangle. Check on b3, king h8, a4, attacking the pawn on b5 because the rook on a7 is not defended, but rook b7 simply removing the rook and introducing rook b6 ideas, getting rid of the queen. So a b5, rook b6, queen d1, and a b5. And very quickly, you see, black managed to repulse white's initial, I would even call it visual initiative. It wasn't a real initiative. And black is in fact starting to take advantage of this very good development and the possibility to open the game on the king side with f5. So after knight bd2, bishop b7, c4, f5, black already has the initiative on the king side. Opening the f-file, the knight can come to f4 if ef5, knight f5. Also the bishop is open, and black won a very nice game in the game between Tari and Van Forest, played at the Wijk tournament in 2021. So very nice game. That was, I would even say, the beginning of the popularity of this delayed Cordell variation in the 21st century. So this shows that these early attacks with d5, d6 don't work for white. So that's the move d5. The other moves will lead us to the positions I already described, for which I described the possible plans. So one such move is the move rook e1, and now king h8, yeah, or simply d6. And we will explore these positions after knight bd2, king h8 via the move order knight bd2. So like I said, these moves knight bd2, rook e1, h3, white plays anyway, and they can be played in different move orders, but the essence of the position remains the same mostly. And it is black who chooses whether to go for these closed positions with d6 or to seek some more open play in the center with knight c7 and d5 or f5, as we shall see. So just an illustration, after rook e1, king h8, which like I said is a good subtlety for black, let's say h3, knight c7, another subtlety, keeping the pawn on e7. And now after knight bishop b3 in the game Nepomniachtchi Gukesh, played this year 2024, black could already strike in the center in one move with d5 and equalize the game. So you see how black can gain advantage by smartly using this move order king h8, knight c7 and keeping the pawn on d7. But nothing wrong with d6, knight b2, and as Gukesh played in that game. So now let's move on to the knight bd2. And here, like I said, the most precise move, I would say most flexible one, is the move king h8. But, and that's probably black's best way to start, keeping flexibility in the position. But in order to show you the slower plans with d6, let's start with d6 in this position. And after rook e1, let's play king h8, h3. Yeah, Black can, of course, transpose to this, but after king h8, I will pay more attention to the more direct plans with play in the center. By this move order, I just want to show you the slower plans in this position. So what does black do here after h3? Like I said, many possible moves. And the character of play here is obviously less forced, and this gives more flexibility to black in the ensuing positions. So one possible way is that just to take on d4 now, yeah, and if cd4, go knight c7, we already spoke about this idea, taking on d4, dropping the knight back, and then preparing d5 or f5. So let's say bishop c2, and now c6 even, preparing d5, yeah, and knight f1, d5 is already nice for black, no problems really, yeah, ed5, knight d5 or queen d5, either way it's good for black. This is one of the type of positions black is striving for, good blockading square on d5 and playing against an IQP on d4. So that's let's say ed4, knight d4 is an alternative, knight d4, and now if cd4, c5 is a possible strike in the center, okay, and if bishop d4, just to show you another possibility in the position, take on d4, take on cd4, and now f5. So you see, it's very rich, it's very I think even a creative position for black, because it allows for all these strikes in the center. And what I particularly like is this practical aspect where it is black who chooses how to react in the center, and white needs to be always prepared for f5, d5, c5 in one version, another version. So I think this gives black a practical advantage. Yeah, so e5, now d5 for example, and then the maneuver knight f4, knight e6, blockading, and with the ideas of g5, f5, g4, attack on the king side. We will see a bit later on how Nakamura actually used this plan to beat Nepomniachtchi in an online game. So that's one plan, ed4, but let's explore the slower ones. Let's say bishop d7, yeah, let's say rook c1, and now b5. Let's say bishop b3, now knight a5, bishop c2, c5. So you have like completely different plan, typical Ruy Lopez plan. The good point being that black is not stuck with a bad bishop on e7, but rather this bishop will be open at some point by playing c4, likely exchanged for white's dark squared bishop, yeah, and black is basically left without bad pieces because the bishop on d7 is a good one with all these pawns on dark squares. And there is always this possibility of opening the play on the king side by pushing f5. Yeah? So just showing you a different type of plan. Yeah, just to show you yet another different type of plan, queen e8, let's say bishop c2, now let's say a5, and just being very flexible, some strategical play, moves that improve the position. I show you this to show you the maneuver I mentioned a bit earlier. Let's say knight f1, and now knight d8, knight g3, knight e6. Yeah, and one of the knights is coming to f4, for example. Yeah. So again, very, very complex strategic play with all the pieces on the board. Again, it's black's choice to choose this type of play or just to choose another type of play. Yeah. So this is the development with the closed, let's say, position that black chooses with the move d6. Now let's turn our attention to the way the elite players are treating this position more often. Of course, they seek more clarity, they seek equality with black, so they play more direct and they go king h8 in this position, rook e1, and now take on d4. Yeah, like I said, these plans are the more direct ones and concrete ones by playing in the center. Now cd4, d5 is already very nice for for black, establishing the IQP after d5, queen d5, yeah, good position. So white normally takes with the knight, knight d4, knight d4, and again, if cd4, d5, ed5, knight e7, yeah, and then the knight is coming to d5 with a good position. Yeah. Also, if black decides, he can also take on d5 with the queen, and the knight can go to f5, maybe put more pressure on d4. So this is not critical. Bishop d4 is more critical, bishop d4, cd4, and now we come to the very interesting moment. This was the position reached in this game that I mentioned at the beginning. Nepomniachtchi Nakamura played in the penultimate round of the Toronto candidates. And if you follow that game live, you probably noticed that Nakamura was playing very fast. playing a tempo, trying to show that this was all his preparation. But in this position, he also continued playing a tempo, and he played a bad move a tempo, mixing up his preparation. So in this position, he played the move d5, which we saw is standard, but in this exact position is not the best one. So he messed up, because after ed5, queen d5, knight e4, this is one of the dangers that black sometimes faces when entering these IQP positions, is that he cannot really establish a good control over the d5 blockading square, and after bishop b3, rook c1, attacking c7 and d5, white actually got an advantage here. Nepomniachtchi misplayed the position, so Nakamura got the draw, but this is a bit problematic for black. With this in mind, it's even more important to understand how to navigate these positions, and obviously Nakamura after the game immediately checked his files and saw that he should have played the move d6. To make it even more interesting, later in the year, the same two players met online, and Nakamura actually demonstrated the move d6 and the improvement. So the idea of d6 is to go f5 in this position. Yeah? But to show the flexibility of black's position, yeah, if here white plays knight f3, black changes the plan and goes d5 here. And after ed5, knight f4. And what is the difference? Well, the difference is that the knight is now on f3 and not on d2. From where it got to e4 as we saw, it can go to c3 to chase away that queen on d5, it can go to c5 and then e6. Whereas on f3 is actually quite bad, being limited by this pawn on f6. So you could say black lost the tempo, but he lost the tempo to worsen white's position. So you understand these subtleties that are not so easy to grasp if you come unprepared to the board. So very nice play for black in the opening, I think, here. So after d6, as I mentioned, the idea is to go f5. Nepomniachtchi went rook c1, f5, e5, yeah, and now knight f4. It's possible to play in different ways. It's also possible to take on e5, d5, fe5, go b5, bishop b7, bishop b3, bishop b7, e6, queen e7. This is quite sharp. White has a dangerous pawn on e6, well protected, but also well blockaded, whereas black has a mobile pawn majority on the queen side. He wants to go c5, c4. So sharp position. Black is obviously objectively doing well. Very good pieces. The bishop on b7, knight can come to f4, maybe create some threats, f4, f3, yeah. But whites also shouldn't be underestimated with this pawn on e6. So this is another way to treat the position. Nakamura went knight f4, and another standard typical plan in these positions, knight f3 and now d5. I mentioned the plan. The knight drops back to e6, blockading the e5 pawn, and then the possibility of g5, f4, g4, and an attack on the king side becomes possibility. So this is what happened in that game. Queen d2, knight e6, b4, c6, just making sure the structure is whole, bishop b3, and already g5, rook d1, g4, knight e1, f4, and black already has a big advantage. Yeah, white has really no active play, and black is attacking on the king side. And actually Nakamura won in 12 more moves from this position against Nepomniachtchi, playing online this year, 2024. So you see quite a kind of a flexible, quite an interesting complex positions that arise in this line, main line, one of the main lines, yeah, where white implements the plan c3 d4 after castling. Now let's go back to the more or less the beginning and explore the plan c3 d4 before castling. So we go back to move 5 and we check the move c3. Knight g7 again, d4, ed4, cd4, and obviously check on b4. This is the drawback of going c3 d4 before castling, because bishop b4 comes with a check. Now those of you who have checked the previous video on the Ruy Lopez, where we explored the line with knight g7 instead of bishop c5, you probably recognize this motive. The difference being in that line the knight is already on g6 and the bishop comes to b4 in one go, whereas here the knight is on e7 and black's bishop comes from c5 to b4, so in two moves. Now this has both pros and cons. The pro is that the knight on e7 is well placed to support the d5 push and gives black better control of that square on e7. So knowing the motive, you will also notice that some of the ideas are quite similar, but the objective evaluation in both cases is that black is doing quite all right in these positions. So now it's a check. White needs to cover it somehow. The worst possibility is knight bd2, because after d5 already black is doing great, because the knight on d2 is blocking the development of the bishop and white's pieces are not quite well placed. Therefore the main moves are knight c3 and bishop d2. So knight c3, d5. The good point for black is that whichever way white chooses, bishop d2 or knight c3, black continues either by taking on d2 and following with d5, or d5 immediately. So d5. Now if allowed, black will take on e4 and play against the IQP. So white goes e5 and now bishop g4. We already saw these ideas in the previous video that I mentioned. These positions are generally quite comfortable for black, whose main idea is to go f6 and undermine this pawn on e5. Play can get sharp. So just to give you some examples, let's say bishop e3 and now f6, ef6, gf6, and what black intends is just actually to go queen d7 long castle and then use the g file to create threats on the king side against white's king, who will castle short. So things can get really exciting if black chooses to do so. But black can also choose calmer lines. Let's say bishop e3, short castle, yeah, and then go f6 and play with the king on the king side. So let's explore also a3, bishop a5, bishop e3, yeah, and now let's say b5, bishop c2, and bishop b6. Yeah, this is quite a recent game. It's also possible for black to go in a slightly different way, queen d7, let's say, preparing long castle at times, yeah, depending on circumstances. Let's say h3, bishop h5, short castle, bishop b6, rook e1, and now f5. So again, you can have some flexibility in the plans. Black can also go for some complications with bishop f3 and knight d4, for example, which eventually lead to some equality, but I think f5 is more exciting, ef6, gf6, and again we have the same idea, long castle, rook h, g8. Yeah. And it's not so easy for white actually to create anything on the queen side, because black has quite a few pieces here and good control over the all these squares, a4, b4, and c4. So that's one possibility after bishop c2, queen d7. There is also bishop b6 with similar ideas. Let's say knight e2, queen d7, knight g3, and long castle. Yeah, a4, king b7. And again, black has really a lot of pieces on the queen side. Nothing really can happen to the king. Yeah, and he will start his own play with f6, maybe h5, h4, and so forth, playing on the king side. So quite interesting middle game ahead. So that is these are the positions with when white reacts after knight c3, d5, e5. Bishop d2 is the more popular move, and after bishop d2, white can take in both ways on d2, but black just continues with d5 either way. So let's check both, queen d2, d5, now e5, bishop g4. Already we mentioned that even with the exchange of dark squared bishops, doesn't really affect the evaluation. Black is quite all right. So e5, otherwise black takes on e4. Yeah? And now black has a choice. He can take with the knight or the queen. Both are perfectly fine. I'll briefly show you both because they are not really critical. Lately Nakamura has been taking with the knight on d5. Previously Grischuk and Pragnanana have taken with the queen on d5. Your call. Yeah. So let's say queen d5. The threat is to give check on e6, so castles, castles, knight c3, and now queen d6 is the safer move. Grischuk played queen h5, but this allows probably white some means to take over the initiative in the game. Sugirov Grischuk, queen d6 is just safer. And if the idea of queen d6 is the knight e4, queen b4, basically attacks the queen on d2 and the bishop on a4, forces exchange of queens with an equal endgame, which in fact black won in the game Giri Pragnananda played online last year. So d5, but now b5, yeah, and let's say bishop c2, b4, dc6, take on d2, knight d2, bc6, bc3, rook b8, and black will regain the pawn, either this one on c6 or the one on c3. Let's say bishop a4, knight d5, attacking the pawn here on c3, and rook b6 is an idea to round up the pawn on c6, or knight b6, attacking the bishop. It's clear that the endgame is equal. So that's, let's say, taking with the queen on d5. Knight d5 is the alternative. Takes on c6, bc, castles, castles. And now what is important for these positions is that black very often sacrifices the pawn on c6 for a very strong initiative. So to give you some examples, let's say knight e5, rook e8. Yeah, this was played in the game Pragnananda Nakamura in Norway Chess 2024. And now knight c6 already is a losing mistake, because after queen f6, attacking that knight on c6, knight e5, knight f4, black is already winning. Yeah, bishop b7 is coming, g2 is under attack, there is a threat of c5 to undermine the knight on e5, rook a d8, and it's already winning advantage for black. So you can see how quickly things can go wrong for white if he gets greedy. Obviously, Pragnananda didn't take the pawn. He played rook e1, but after bishop f5, knight c3, knight b4, the position was equal. Black has double pawns on c6 and c7. White has an IQP on d4. These cancel each other out, and thanks to the good development, good squares for the pieces, black doesn't really have problems, and the game was drawn in some 31 moves. So that's one idea, knight e5. Another idea to show you the dangers of going after that pawn on c6. Let's go rook c1, rook e8, rook c6. But again, bishop b7, rook goes back to c1, and queen f6. It's exactly the same development. Bishop goes to b7, queen goes to f6, and the threat is knight f4. And once the knight is on f4, there is a threat of bishop f3, there is a threat of knight e2 check, and things are becoming dangerous for white. Now he needs to make a series of only moves actually to equalize from this position. So white shouldn't get greedy, he should go knight c3, but already this is fine for black. Nakamura played two games here, one against Nepomniachtchi, where he took on c3, queen c3, bishop e6, and then with next bishop d5, black is actually perfectly rock solid. Yeah, fantastic bishop on d5, defending c6, attacking the knight on f3. The tactical justification is as taking on c6 after bishop d5, queen c3, bishop f3. Black has no problems. If white takes with the queen on f3, queen d4, regains the pawn, attacks the pawn on b2, and in case of gf3, the long-term problems with the king give black excellent compensation. So that's one possibility, and the other one is to go bishop e6 immediately, knight e5. And now in the online game Gorodetsky Nakamura played queen f6, which is imprecise, because in that particular position white can take on c6, as the bishop is on e6 not coming to b7, so that's problematic. But simply going back knight e7, defending the pawn, and then going f6 or c5 next, black is fine. Let's say rook c1, f6, knight f3, bishop f7, no problems whatsoever. c6 is well protected, there's good blockading square on d5, and black can develop, yeah, queen d7, rook d8 maybe, and so forth. Again, equality. So there is a pleasant choice between taking on d5 with the queen or the knight in this line, queen d2, d5, ed5. Knight bd2 is the last line we need to check, d5. And again, if allowed, black will take on e4, so e5, and now short castle, and here the plans with bishop g4, as we saw previously, are perfectly fine. No problems for black there, but I like in this particular position the move bishop f5, because it introduces this idea of knight b4, okay, and targeting these squares d3, c2, and after knight b4 there is this possibility to advance with b5, c5 in the center. So to illustrate, let's say rook e1, and now knight b4. Yeah? And the idea is already to go something like b5, hit that bishop, knight d3, c5, and take over the initiative on the queen side. So knight h4, harassing the bishop on f5, but now c5 already. Yeah, knight f5, knight f5, knight f3, and now black can decide how ambitious he wants to be. If he's ambitious, he can go c4, creating already a dangerous queenside majority. b5 is coming, the knight drops back, b4, and advancing on the queen side. Or if he's interested just to kind of equalize the game, then b5, bishop c2, knight c2, queen c2, knight d4, knight d4, cd4, with an equal position, as in the game Ivanchuk Artemiev played this year in Dubai. So this is the illustration of this idea of knight b4 and c5. Makes sense for white to stop it, so a3, but now we already know what black should do, which is undermining of the center with the move f6. Yeah. Now if ef6, queen, rook f6, black has really easy play. Queen comes to d6, rook comes to f8. All the pieces are well placed, and black can develop some play on the king side. Knight g6, maybe knight f4, bishop g4, and the doubled rooks on the f file give him quite active possibilities there. And if white does not take on f6 and goes rook e1, then black takes on e5, f takes e5, d takes e5, and now knight g6. And again with a pretty complex middle game position, but good play for black again. Maybe knight f4, knight e6, maybe bishop g4, pinning that knight, maybe queen e8 or queen d7, rook coming to the center. And don't forget, obviously, that black has this central majority that can start moving forward at some point. And that was it. Perhaps a bit longer than expected, especially when I mentioned that there's only one critical plan for white and two variations of that plan. But I went in a bit more depth here to show you the intricacies, some move order subtleties, to explain the plans. So I think just after watching this video, you should feel comfortable including this line in your repertoire. Obviously, I always recommend doing some independent work after looking at these videos, but for a starter, I think this video should suffice. So thanks for watching, guys. You can see that I've put my links on the screen. You can check out my Chessable courses, subscribe to my Substack. I'm planning some big announcement pretty soon when it comes to my YouTube channel and my Substack, so stay tuned for that. And thanks for watching. Now comes my Cowboy Hikaru moment when I kindly ask you to smash that subscribe button and enjoy these videos in the future as well. Like I said, I want to introduce some things, new things, to give you some bit more power to my subscribers and viewers in the near future, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, like again, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe, comment, let me know what you think, and I'll see you soon. Again, take care, everybody.